there's one over here.
Can you tell us a little bit about your current work?
I had a fellowship at the Library of Congress a few years ago, working on the World War I arts and crafts-based occupational therapy, and it's slow going, but there is a book project that is including the work of other fellows who had been at the Library of Congress in fellowships and who had topics that related to creative responses to war trauma, and that book, as we move along, will look at how different countries and individuals responded, starting with the French Revolution and going up to the present day. And topics include, artwork and film. I'm trying to think of all the different media, memoirs, fiction, and across the world, and different responses over a 250-year period. So that's my current projects.
Of the works in this exhibition, which of them tug at you particularly, strike a chord in what your experiences have been with victims of war?
In some ways, it's really more the artists themselves, and certain artists who, like the artists who did the work that I had compared to the arts and crafts related work, which is Abraham Peter Hankin. He was a kid. He was sent to the U.S. By his Russian family to study at Pennsylvania Academy, and he was either 12 or 13, and he enlisted and the military took him. They took him, and on the battlefield, and he must have had a compassionate commanding officer, because he was held back and said, "You just stay here and you do drawings of the landscape and the combat zone." And everyone in the troop that he would have been, sent out, they were all killed. And so his life was saved by that commander. But then he experienced mustard gas, and he had a wound to his hand. And when he came back, he ended up having a patron who, and he studied music. He was being trained to be a tenor, and he was sent to France to be a tenor. So his experience was very much like what the Reconstruction aides were all interested in terms of finding another path for people who probably could not go back to the work that they had done initially before the war.
Some of your work about the last segment that you were going to talk about, loss and memory, could you maybe just
say something
yeah,
about those?
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So those two works, they're just heartfelt. Those two pieces. The George Braque, who was the co-founder of Cubism with Picasso, and here it is. He's something like 50 years later. He makes this piece as a tribute. I mean, it's a piece that is a commemoration for his 80th birthday, he dedicates it to Apollinaire, who was one of the World War I poets and art critics, all in the circle that, you know, that Brock was in. And so here he is, and I mean, both pieces, and the Chagall piece, which is a tribute, you know, and a memorial to his wife who died suddenly. She had, I mean, today she would have just easily been treated, but she got strep throat, and it killed her because they could not get, and her daughter apparently was able to get some penicillin, but it was too late by the time they got it to her. And Chagall and Bella had been together since 1909. You know, it was one of those couples that was love at first sight, and you know, and her parents didn't approve of him because he was a poor artist, and she was from a, you know, a nice, well-established family of jewelers. But their, you know, their love persisted, and they got married, and they, you know, had one child, and Bella became a writer herself and an editor, and after her sudden death, Chagall didn't paint for a year. He was so distraught by her death that he didn't do anything for a year. And then when he started again, he started doing images that commemorated her, and then the book that she had written that was in a manuscript form, he had it published, had it translated from Yiddish, which is how she had written it initially, had it published, and then all of that happened in these years from 41 to 46 when he was living in the U.S., and by 47 he went back to France. He married again later, but Bella was the love of his life. And so it's both pieces by Brock and Chagall, you know, one was painted, you know, 40 years after the war, and after the memories that Brock would have had with Apollinaire, and 20 years after, you know, the death of Bella. So commemoration and memorials continue and happen at many levels.
Each time, Tara, we have someone talk or we do a tour, that we bring up that there was a pandemic 100 years ago. We bring up the rise of far-right activists and worse. Are you drawing parallels? I just think it's an interesting thing to ask people who are, in fact, sort of studying the work, looking at it. Do you see parallels to where we are at this moment in history?
Oh, yeah. Oh, definitely. Let me just, so I can see people. In terms of pandemic, Apollinaire died from the Spanish flu. Klimt died during the Spanish flu. And Egon Schiele and his wife, who was 6 months pregnant, died from the Spanish flu. And I mean, in terms of the parallels, you know, we've been in a period of almost, you know, endless war since 2001. And now, following all these years of war, we're now in this worldwide pandemic. And yeah, there's parallels. There's definitely parallels.
Tara, did you want to finish with maybe just a brief statement about, you mentioned about the hope of change in looking at some of the African American works that were included?
Oh, okay, yeah. So I'll just talk a little bit about that. There's two pieces that were done by artists who had also served during the war, and one is Charles White, and the other is Peter L. Robinson Jr. And as I did the research on them, these two men had entirely different kinds of experiences. And I started with Charles White because his experiences have a lot of, systemic racism connected to how the arts, how he was able to participate in the arts. And then as somebody who served in the war, I went back and looked at the experiences of the African American troops that were in World War I, and how there was a kind of ongoing hope that, okay, if we go and serve this country that we're a part of, when we come back, we should be given equal rights and social and racial justice. We should get that. And that did not happen at all. And so I had in here Horace Pippin. Do you all know who Horace Pippin is? He was he lived in Chester County, Pennsylvania. He was from upstate New York, but he had been part of a World War I troop that was nicknamed by the Germans the Hellfighters. And so they called themselves the Harlem Hellfighters. And the Germans called them that because they were the fiercest group of combatants that they had encountered in the war. They were just fierce. And Pippin was a part of that unit, that regiment. And he, at almost to the end of the war, it was like September or October, before the armistice was called, he was wounded, and he lay out in no man's land for about a day and a half. They could not get him out, and finally they got him out. And his experience coming back after the war, he did not get the experience of going to the hospitals and being treated for, through the kind of occupational therapy that was happening for the white soldiers coming home. And so for him, he ended up dealing with, the nightmares and the trauma, and he started making his own artwork. And Pippin kind of ended up being like the quintessential ideal of, a really strong World War I artist, African American man, because of his war service. And, another artist said, you didn't mess with him, you didn't say any smart alecky things to Horace Pippin. And when the Second World War happened, Pippin he was very upset to see that these young African American soldiers going in for the Second World War were experiencing the same things he was feeling and had experienced. And he did a painting that's at the Philadelphia Museum of Art that's called Mr. Prejudice. And the painting is divided in two parts. One part has the African Americans on one side, and at the bottom of it, he has painted himself into it in his World War I uniform. And on the other side is all these images of racist white culture, with a figure breaking down through a big V, because the double V was what the African communities, it was like V for victory, and then V for their own equality after the war. And, you know, and again, nothing changed, but then something did change. And in 1948, Truman signed an executive order that desegregated the military. I think it's 9981, Executive Order 9981. And instantly, the military was no longer to be a segregated institution. Well, you know, that takes a while. But somebody like Peter L. Robinson Jr. really benefited from that. Between that, the Truman executive order and the GI Bill of Rights afterwards, he very likely was able to use the GI Bill for his college, to cover his college. He went to Howard University. He is really interesting. I lived in Washington, D.C. for much of my adult life, and seeing, reading about him, it was like, oh, I know people like him. I have friends who are that kind of man, African man in Washington. So he was the son of a man who had been one of the first officers in a World War I military unit. And when he came back, he set up his life, and because I know DC, I think that family lived in the Petworth neighborhood, Washington, DC, and he worked for the DC school system. He had 3 or 4 children, and had his whole career in the DC school system teaching industrial arts and military science. 44 years in the DC school system. So then he has a son that, grows up in this family, benefits from having a father who had served in World War I, came back, who then stayed in the reserves. He's remained in the military and the reserves, stayed in that until he retired from his teaching in 1958. And then his son goes on to serve in the war, and then being able to use his art for a job in the military at NASA at a very high level. And so his experiences, solid, second generation DC, Washingtonian, and African American family, in contrast to Charles White, who was raised by his mother, a single mother. And so as I looked at Charles White's 2 pieces in this show, and I thought about, oh, he was raised by a single mother. He's tapping into the agony of mothers, African American mothers, who have sent their children, their sons, off to war, and one is there waiting for him to come home, and the other one is probably grieving his son. Very different experiences. I had fun putting this talk together. It's a lot of work, but it was worth it.
Any other questions for Dr. Tappert? Well, please join me in thanking you.